When you think of homelessness, a homeless person, who do you imagine? What do you believe are the root causes of family homelessness? And how will you address them in your election?
Well, when I think of homelessness, I think of human beings who are very much a part of our city, who are struggling on the streets inside our shelters. And when I think of homelessness, I don't just think of it in terms of the audits I've done or the investigations I've done, but I try to think about the homeless individuals I've met along the way, good people who have not gotten the services they need. And the people who shake me up the most are the kids in homeless shelters, the kids who every day are doing their homework at a little desk with their family watching them, because I've actually been in the shelters, the family shelters. I've talked to the parents and the children. I see a lot of love, I see a lot of hope, but I see a city that has not responded to our homeless families. And there are now 13,000 families and over 22,000 children in the homeless shelter system. 90% of these families are Black and Latino, many are single mothers. And we know that many families in shelter are not there because of eviction. Actually, 41% of they're seeking shelter from domestic violence. So I see a lot of things, I feel a lot of things, and it's great to talk with people who've actually had the experiences and want to make change.
Miss Rhonda, would you like to ask the next question?
Since you have talked with the families in shelter, and I know what pretty much your background, the personal experiences that you have qualifies you to help us. How will your administration, would you revamp your administration? Because the buck really begins and ends with you. So as someone who has went into the shelters, and as someone, no one of us has been untouched by COVID-19, how will you be able to address and be involved in helping those families?
I'm going to be a mayor with a housing first model. See, you
Oh, I
can't
love
manage
housing
homelessness.
first.
Well, you can't manage homelessness. You need to intervene and rapidly rehouse New Yorkers. The problem with all of the discussions on how to end homelessness is that we keep trying to fix it without homes. So the first thing the
That's
mayor
right.
has to do is build the housing that we actually need to move people from shelter into true low-income housing. And I have a plan that would make it possible to build 40,000 affordable housing units, but I mean low-income housing units that would include supportive housing. And I believe that's the best way to deal with the homeless crisis, because at the end of the day, if we don't have homes for the homeless, then all we're going to have is homeless. And that we need a model now that's going to build housing. Bill de Blasio, our mayor, built affordable housing, but he built more housing for families of three making $150,000 a year than families of three making less than $40,000 a year. And I will put every agency to work to reduce homelessness, but most importantly, intervene before it starts. Because part of what we've got to do is build a long-term strategy that does speak to the centerpiece of affordability and low-income housing, but there's so much more that has to be done in terms of drop-in centers, safe haven beds, stabilization beds, all the things that we know of, but there doesn't seem to be enough because we haven't scaled to what the crisis is.
Cycling back for a second to Ms. Khadijah's first question, I just wanted to ask around in terms of addressing the root causes. Like you mentioned, like there are a lot of issues that underlie this crisis. So besides just addressing, housing, are there other issues that need to be addressed to address like the root causes that result in people ending up homeless?
Part of what I think we have to come to terms with is when you have an inadequate affordable housing plan, and so you allow luxury developers to come into communities, take up a lot of land, build a lot of luxury housing with the promise of building affordable housing, then you find out that that affordable housing in places like East New York and other parts of our city, it turns out that that housing is unaffordable for the residents who live there. You end up creating a push into homeless shelters because people get forced out of their homes. And what we've seen is gentrification in so many communities of color because the rezonings were geared towards the developer and luxury housing. They were not geared towards actually building the low income housing. So we really did these rezonings and this homeless strategy backwards. I want to go back to a different model, a model that Mayor LaGuardia had when he built public housing. It was for low-income New Yorkers that aspired to the middle class. And that was a great part of our housing history. The first public housing development was on the Lower East Side, it built in 1938, and it became aspirational for thousands and thousands of people. In fact, where I grew up in Washington Heights, whether it was Dyckman houses or Marble Hill houses, was very much a part of our community. But today, through the divestment of affordable housing, we have not yet figured out how to preserve what we have and build the next generation of low-income housing. And we need to do that because low-income housing are for the cab drivers, the cooks, the waiters, the daycare workers, the people who take care of our children and grandparents. And we have not built the housing that they need. And this is part of the crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Yes, thank you. I'm going to have Ms. Rhonda move on to her next question. Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Hi. So my next question deals with getting and staying out of shelter. And I want to thank you for not saying permanent housing because there is no such thing. But how will you ensure that families who leave shelter stay housed? I too love the housing first model. And so that I believe would help. Do you think that would help families to stay out of shelter by using that model?
Yeah, but let's figure out how we also help people and what we mean by moving people from shelter into supportive housing. One, a lot of people need services, so they must be provided. A lot of people need jobs and job retraining. And after this pandemic, I want to ensure that people have an opportunity to participate in real workforce development programs, to go back into the job market, to make sure that the children who are in shelters are getting the services they need, whether it's mental health services and the like. Think about what's happening with the kids. I just did an audit, Rhonda, that showed that in the family shelters that have kids 0 to 3, right? So I'm talking about the babies. In our audit, we found cribs with mice droppings. We found cribs next to overheated radiators. We found shelter conditions that were so atrocious. I cannot believe that this administration accepts that children live in these conditions. When I'm mayor, this is all going to change. We're going to think how we provide essential services, how we create job retraining, but also I am never going to allow one single child to ever again be in a dangerous situation. The parents that are in homeless shelters are there and they love their children and they want to do everything they can. And it's the job of this big fancy government of ours and this city to provide these services. Look, Wall Street made $38 billion during this pandemic, $38 billion. They made bank. And I believe that it's time for our recovery to center on the people who are very much part of our city. They just happen to not make a lot of money. They haven't had the same opportunities. And it's time to reverse the priorities in the city. And I'm going to use my experience as controller, as borough president, to be ready on day one to meet the housing and the supportive service challenges of homeless and the people who are about to be homeless in our city.
Kata, do you want to ask the first DV question?
Sure. Before the pandemic, DVs was already the leading cause of family homelessness. However, while there are no time limits on DV shelters, DV emergency shelters give survivors a 90-day deadline to leave, with a possible extensions of up to 180 days. It's almost impossible for a survivor to recover in that time and recover from the trauma of the situation. What will you do to help DV shelters and the survivors?
Well, domestic violence is the root cause for 41% of families in shelter, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, more people are in shelter because of domestic violence than for just ordinary eviction. And so I believe that we have to address this head on. First, we have got to reform the lease determination laws so that survivors don't need to obtain a court order or alert their abuser to leave an unsafe home. I know how important this is because when I was in the assembly, I was one of the leading legislators on introducing laws that would protect domestic violence victims, and I've carried this with me for the last 30 years. I would also immediately increase capacity in the HRA shelter system because let's face it, survivors need to stay past 180 days. And, and that's why they need to get services and stability even after they leave the shelters. But we cannot put a timeline on the shelter system because everybody's situation is different. And I think we need to make it easier for survivors to get support and stay in their homes. But once they go into the shelter system, they must become a real priority. Also, there's a great piece of legislation. It's called the Hevesy-Kruger statewide rent supplement bill that would assist vulnerable populations. That includes survivors to create the resources that we need to help.
Thank you, Controller. And Ms. Rhonda, do you want to ask the next DV question?
Sure. The next one says, what comes from survivors often find that those shelters are in low-income neighborhoods that struggle with crime, and it makes the survivors feel less safe. How administration change this, and in general, how will you counter opposition from high-income and privileged neighborhoods to the sightings of shelter? And I just want to say, again, I read your article about community involvement. You believe community should be involved. So how will the community help DV shelters, and their locations?
Well, since I've been an elected official, I have made sure that the siting of homeless shelters, the siting of domestic violence shelters are very much a part of every community I represented. I can show you today, Rhonda, the different shelters that are in neighborhoods that I worked on that still exist because the community in part is supporting those initiatives. You see, you got to go into communities and build support for helping people who just happen to be in a vulnerable space. I have a feeling that most New Yorkers believe that that is our obligation as a city. And the ones that don't say no to so many things, that they're not to be the loud voice in the room. And what I've always done is directly take these issues on head on, and I've never backed down. And you listen to communities, but you also know that at the end of the day, the mission is to safely site facilities, domestic violence shelters, and other facilities in all communities, whether they're upscale or low-income neighborhoods. Everybody should be wanting and willing to help those who are struggling. And that is what society should be about. That's been my record. And, becoming mayor of New York, I don't have to learn how to do this because I've been doing this since I was a state assemblyman, since I was Manhattan Borough president, as controller. I ask tough questions about shelter safety. I want to make sure that any child, any domestic violence survivor is going to walk into a shelter that's safe. So I have no problem holding shelter operators accountable. And I'm very suspicious of slumlords that are trying to game the system. But at the end of the day, everybody should want to help people. And that has been my philosophy as an elected official. And most importantly, as a human being, because everybody is one paycheck away, one tragedy away, one incident, and then everybody will find themselves in an equal situation.
Ms. Kaded, would you like to ask the question that talks about that cost issue?
Okay, as was said before, I used to be in a shelter, and the shelter I was actually in the Bronx, I've been to a couple of them actually, and the room itself I found out was $4,000, which to me is outrageous if you think about the rent in New York City. Even though rent in New York City is very, very high, $4,000 would have a long way for me and my daughter to live. So knowing that statistic, like that information, the question is for you is sorry. Oh, that is the question. These days it's popular to say we need housing, not shelter. But how especially would you move away from shelter spending and making sure there is real housing for those most in need?
So again, I think I mentioned this earlier, the city has this backwards. They spend more time negotiating with slumlords to pay them $4,000 a month to house a woman and child, in your case, in a homeless shelter, than they do to build affordable housing. And I think we need a real housing plan that aligns shelter services or homeless services and an affordable housing plan. And here's what I'm going to do as mayor. I'm going to access the thousands of vacant property in this city. property that the city owns, taxpayer owned, we own it, right? Rather than give it to shelter operators and luxury developers, I'm going to give that land back to the people as mayor. I'm going to work with community-based organizations and not-for-profits to build the low-income housing we need. I'm going to redirect the 421A subsidy, which is basically a luxury subsidy that's developer-centric, and rather create a subsidy that actually lowers the AMI and builds the actual housing we need for people who make under $40,000 a year trying to feed a child and support a family. That is what we have to do. Rather than bragging about building 90 shelters, I want to build 90 buildings that reflect the rich diversity and the housing need of people in our 5 boroughs. And we have done this in the city before. We built public housing in the 30s. We built Mitchell-Ama housing in the 50s and 60s. We actually gave abandoned buildings back to community organizations in the 80s and 90s and created whole new communities. And we have not done that in the past 8 years. In fact, we have just built luxury housing and we sprinkled in unaffordable housing along the way. As mayor, my plan is specific, it's detailed, it's real, and I will implement it on day one.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Ms. Rana, do you want to ask one of the next questions?
Okay, this pretty much is about your luxury housing bill that you want to implement, because I came from shelter and I got placed in a luxury housing building. So the city has programs to help families avoid eviction, like home base and the City for HEPS vouchers, which keeps changing. So how will you help families who have those vouchers from becoming displaced because the city is not paying their portion of the rent? How would you include the landlords in that conversation once the eviction moratorium ends?
Well, we're going to have a couple of things. First of all, the shelter allowance is inadequate when you're trying to get a 1-bedroom apartment, and I would raise it at least to $1,700 to $2,000. If you really want to help people get housing, you have to be realistic as to where the housing market is. In terms of people who are now in housing where they can't pay the rent, and by the way, it is a very real crisis that the next mayor is going to have to come to terms with. The truth is, through no fault of anybody, this pandemic forced the city and the country to shut down the economy, and many people lost their jobs. When you think about where this city was pre-pandemic, we had a 3.4% unemployment rate. We had added 970,000 jobs to the economy in 10 years. And once COVID came in March a year ago, that unemployment rate went to 20%. In communities of color, it was 25%. Young people actually had hit unemployment rates of 35% and up. And those 970,000 jobs, we lost 900,000. So that means there are people who simply are not going to be able to pay the back rent, and right now we're unemployed. So we need to take some of that $6.1 billion in stimulus money that we're going to get, and more that will follow. We need to create programs to cancel rent for people who we create a program for. And for small landlords, we need to create mortgage forgiveness and align the banks and the mortgages and the tenants and landlords. And that negotiation and those programs have to emanate from City Hall. I believe I'm the best qualified to build that consensus and build those programs, because we cannot have mass eviction on the streets of New York. And if I'm mayor, that's not going to happen.
Children in shelter don't have Wi-Fi, and parents are trying hard to make the ends meet. How are you going to make sure that homeless children don't fall through the cracks in the education system?
It's a great question, Rhonda. It's something I think about every day. You know, I'm an older dad. I have 2 little kids in public school. So I have a 3rd grader and a 2nd grader. And I can tell you this has been a very tough time for our kids. They lost their grandmother in April. There was no closure. They've gone through some stuff. But here's the advantage that I have and my wife has. We have 2 incomes. If something breaks or a computer breaks, we have a credit card. If they need extra help, we can afford to do that. The problem is that in this school system, there are so many parents who love those children who don't have money. They're not working. They're suffering. And in the homeless shelters and in public housing, the remote devices don't work. The internet capacity isn't there. The city has slow walked these children. They're going to even fall farther behind. And I'm going to be the mayor that works for the children in the school system. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my audits and smash the bureaucracy at the Department of Education. I'm going to redirect resources to build a real mental health foundation for our children. I'm going to make sure that every child that needs a device has a device. I'm going to upend this whole slow walking of internet access and make sure that every child has it with a real internet passport for parents who are struggling financially. How dare we, in the midst of a pandemic, sacrifice our children? And that is what's happening at the Department of Education. We know where the vulnerable kids are. They're in homeless shelters, they're in public housing, and they're not getting the support they need. I've talked to parents who have one remote device for 3 children. I know with my own kids, they would last 10 minutes on one device, and every parent knows that to be true. So why do we accept one device and no internet access in a public housing development when we will never accept that on Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue? That's the problem with this city administration. It's all about checking the box, making sure nobody finds out what the secrets are. But as controller, I've been the one speaking truth to power. I've done the audits, I've done the investigations. And when I get to City Hall, I'm going to already know where to go and how we help the kids.
In 2016, they put DHS and HRA together under one system. And Steve Banks was put in charge of both. How do you feel about the how do you feel about this and them combining it? And also, what would you do differently as mayor to make these systems run successfully?
Look, the mayor's got to be in charge. And we have not seen leadership coming out of City Hall. We haven't seen it on housing policy. We haven't seen it on education policy. And we definitely have not seen it on homeless policy. What I could tell you today is that I'm going to be hands-on. I'll build the best administration. I'll build an administration that's actually about problem solving, reducing homelessness, building low-income housing, making sure that we take care of our most vulnerable, especially our children. You see, I've done the audits and investigations. I've tried very successfully to hold this administration accountable. So I know where the money is, I know where the dysfunction is, and I've also put out specific ideas on all of these issues. And that's what we need in a mayor. You know, talk is cheap right now when kids are hanging on it by the edge and when people can't find the low income housing they need. We need somebody who's going to go in and just take care of business.
Will you
And
keep the two
step to City
departments?
Hall to inside.
Mrs. Scott, will you keep the two departments the same structure though, like both of them together?
I don't know. I think that more is about bureaucracy. I'll look at it through the lens of what experts say and streamline the bureaucracy. But again, I believe this is a city hall capacity issue because the mayor is the one who will dictate the policy and then figure out ways to get that implementation done.